Hash hash. There are still grains of desert sand trapped inside an old notebook I keep in my closet. I've tried to shake them out more times than I can remember. They never completely disappear. Maybe that's why I've never been able to forget what happened during Desert Storm. For more than 30 years, I told people the same simple version of that deployment. We completed our missions. We came home. End of story. It was easier that way. Because the truth begins with a mission that wasn't supposed to last more than a single night, and ends with 4 Special Forces soldiers walking away from their objective before sunrise, without knowing if we had just saved our own lives, or failed the people counting on us. I've replayed that morning thousands of times. I've imagined waiting another 10 minutes, another 30, another hour. Every version ends differently in my mind. Only one actually happened. This isn't a story about the biggest battle of Desert Storm. There were men who faced far greater dangers than we ever did. This is the story of one quiet mission that almost disappeared beneath the sand, and one decision that has followed me longer than the war itself. If you've ever wondered what Special Forces soldiers carry home long after they leave the battlefield, pull up a chair. I'll tell you about the morning our extraction never came. Hash. There are missions you remember because everything went according to plan. Then there are the ones you remember because nothing did. More than 30 years have passed since Desert Storm, and I've spent most of that time avoiding questions about those weeks in the Saudi desert. People usually ask about firefights, explosions, or whether we were scared. Those aren't the memories that stay with me. The one that never leaves comes back just before sunrise. Every time. I've never spoken publicly about that mission. Not because it was classified anymore. Time has a way of loosening secrets. I stayed quiet because I never found the right words. Some decisions make perfect sense while you're making them. Years later, they become harder to explain, even to yourself. In early 1991, I was serving with a Special Forces team assigned to support coalition operations during Desert Storm. We weren't there to chase glory or collect stories for history books. Most of our work happened where almost nobody could see it. Slip behind enemy lines. Watch. Report. Leave without anyone knowing we had ever been there. If everything went well, nobody outside our command would ever hear our names. The afternoon before that mission, we were called into a canvas operations tent. A large map covered one wall. Colored grease pencil markings stretched across the Iraqi border. Small lights hung from the tent poles, but they barely pushed back the dust floating in the air. A captain I had never met before stood beside the map. He didn't waste words. "You'll insert after dark." He pointed toward a small grid square. Observation only. Another mark. Possible mobile command site. Then one final instruction. If confirmed, prepare target designation. That was it. Questions were welcome, but answers were short. Mike Carson, our team leader, asked about extraction. Before sunrise, the captain replied, "What if weather changes?" "It won't." Mike nodded once. That should have reassured me. It didn't. Our team was small. Mike Carson came from Central Texas. Before joining the Army, he'd worked cattle with his father. He rarely raised his voice. He didn't need to. If Mike spoke, people listened. He had already told us that when his enlistment ended, he planned to buy a small ranch not far from where he'd grown up. Luis Ortega handled communications. He grew up outside Tucson, Arizona. His parents had crossed into the United States years earlier looking for work. Luis enlisted because college seemed impossible without military benefits. He carried pictures of his girlfriend folded inside a waterproof notebook. He hoped to marry her once he got home. Eric Nolan was our observer and marksman. Montana born and raised. He knew wildlife better than cities. Eric could identify distant movement long before anyone else noticed it. He joked that after the Army, He'd spend the rest of his life working as a park ranger somewhere people didn't talk much. Then there was me. I wasn't the strongest shooter or the fastest runner. My responsibility was navigation, target confirmation, and operating the laser designator if command authorized an airstrike. I trusted maps more than luck and routines more than instinct. That probably sounds boring. Out there, boring kept people alive. As sunset approached, we laid our equipment across a tarp beside our Humvee. Nobody rushed. Nobody joked very much. Every item had its place. Suppressed carbines, extra magazines, night vision goggles, military GPS receiver, paper maps sealed inside plastic, laser designator packed inside its protective case, radio batteries, medical kit, 2 canteens each, 3 MREs, camouflage netting. Mike walked past each of us without saying much. He simply looked. A loose strap, a twisted antenna, an unsecured buckle. Small mistakes become large problems once helicopters leave. I remember checking my GPS twice, then unfolding the paper map anyway. Technology was useful. Paper never lost satellites. Luis was testing the radio frequencies while Eric cleaned sand from the lenses of his binoculars. "You nervous?" Luis asked without looking up. "A little." He smiled. "Good." I looked at him. "If you're never nervous," he said, "you're probably not paying attention." Mike overheard us. "Enough talking." Nobody answered. Silence returned almost immediately. Outside the tent, darkness settled over the desert faster than I expected. During the day, the sand reflected heat until everything shimmered. At night, the temperature dropped enough that you could see your breath if you looked carefully. Someone handed each of us another bottle of water. Last chance before lift. I drank only half. Old habit. Never finish water when you don't know when you'll get more. About an hour later we heard the helicopter before we saw it. The Black Hawk stayed low, almost blending into the darkness. Its rotor washed through sand against our uniforms as we climbed aboard. Inside, nobody could hear normal conversation. Mike leaned close enough for us to read his lips. "Same plan." Everyone nodded. The flight lasted less than an hour, though it felt longer. Nobody looked at one another. Most of us stared at the floor or checked equipment for the 10th time. Every now and then the helicopter banked sharply. Loose straps swayed overhead. The smell inside was a mixture of hydraulic fluid, canvas, sweat, and diesel drifting in whenever the side door opened slightly. Finally the crew chief gave us the signal. 30 seconds. We stepped onto open desert under almost complete darkness. No lights. No landmarks. Only stars. The helicopter lifted away almost immediately. Within seconds, the sound faded into the distance until only wind remained. 4 men. Miles behind enemy lines. Completely alone. Mike unfolded the map one final time beneath a dim red lens flashlight. He compared it with my GPS. Everything matched. He looked toward the eastern horizon where dawn would arrive many hours later. Then he quietly said something that stayed with me far longer than I expected. "Remember." He paused. "If pickup isn't on time." He didn't finish the sentence. He folded the map. "We stick to the timeline." None of us asked why. We simply adjusted our packs, switched on our night vision goggles, and disappeared into the darkness. At the time, I thought the mission had finally begun. Looking back now, I think the real story started the moment that Black Hawk flew away. The first hour after insertion was always the most dangerous. Not because someone was looking for us. Because our bodies were still adjusting. The helicopter noise lingered in our ears. Our breathing was faster than normal, even after years of training. It took time for your senses to settle into the rhythm the mission demanded. Mike led. I followed a few yards behind with the GPS in one hand and the folded map tucked inside my vest. Eric stayed slightly higher on the ridge whenever the terrain allowed, scanning through his night vision goggles. Luis remained at the rear, carrying the radio antenna low against his pack so it wouldn't silhouette against the horizon. Nobody needed reminders. Spacing, noise discipline, light discipline. Everything became automatic after enough training. The desert at night looked nothing like people imagine. Movies always show endless dunes glowing beneath the moon. Most of northern Saudi Arabia and southern Iraq wasn't like that. There were stretches of packed gravel, scattered rocks, shallow depressions, and low ridgelines that became our only cover. Every few hundred yards we stopped, knelt, and listened. Not for voices. For engines. Metal carries surprisingly far through cold desert air. After nearly 2 hours of moving, Mike raised his fist. We froze instantly. He crouched behind a cluster of weathered rocks and motioned us down. Eric slowly lifted his binoculars. A convoy. Too far away to identify clearly. No lights. Just faint silhouettes moving north. We watched for almost 5 minutes before Mike gave another hand signal. Not our objective. Move. No words were spoken. We continued east. The cold surprised people who had never spent nights in the desert. By midnight my gloves felt stiff. The temperature had dropped so quickly that every breath carried a little moisture inside my balaclava. Hours earlier we'd been sweating. Now my fingers felt numb each time I unfolded the map. Around 1 in the morning we reached the ridge our briefing photographs had shown. From there the terrain sloped gently toward a broad basin. That basin overlooked the area we had been sent to observe. Mike studied it through night vision for nearly a full minute before whispering. "This is it." The observation point wasn't impressive. Just a shallow depression between broken rock formations. Exactly the kind of place most vehicles would drive past without noticing. We spent nearly 30 minutes preparing it. Eric and I unfolded camouflage netting while Luis buried extra equipment beneath loose gravel. Mike checked every angle from which someone might accidentally spot movement. When everything was finished, even I had trouble seeing our own position from 20 yards away. That was the point. Disappear. Then wait. Waiting became the mission. People often imagine special forces constantly moving. Most of our work involved staying perfectly still. Minutes stretched into hours. Eric watched through binoculars. I alternated between the laser designator case, my notebook, and the GPS receiver. Luis listened to the radio through one earpiece, speaking only when necessary. Mike never stopped scanning. He seemed capable of staring at the same patch of desert for half an hour without blinking. Near 3 in the morning, Luis quietly handed me half of an MRE. Chicken and rice. Cold. Compressed. Not exactly memorable. I nodded. He grinned. Better than army coffee. I almost laughed. Almost. Instead I took a bite. The crackers tasted like dry cardboard. The peanut butter packet was frozen enough to resist squeezing. Still, calories mattered more than flavor. We each took careful sips from our canteens. Nobody drank more than necessary. Water planning began the moment helicopters left. The radio remained mostly silent. Every hour Luis transmitted a brief scheduled report. Position secure. Observation ongoing. No compromise. The replies were equally short. Continue. Nothing else. As darkness settled deeper, conversation became rare. But silence has a way of making people talk about ordinary things. Eric finally broke it. When I get home. Nobody looked away from their sectors. I'm buying a fishing boat. Luis smiled. In Montana? No. Then where? Anywhere there aren't sandstorms. Mike shook his head slightly. You don't even know how to fish. I'll learn. A pause. What about you, Luis? My girlfriend already picked a wedding date. You tell her? No. Mike chuckled under his breath. That's brave. Luis shrugged. If I survive this place, I can survive that conversation. For a few seconds, we sounded like four friends sitting around a campfire. Then silence returned. The desert has a way of reminding you where you are. Just before dawn, movement appeared near the objective. Eric noticed it first. Vehicle. Mike shifted beside him. Then another vehicle emerged, followed by another. I raised my binoculars. The briefing had described a temporary command location. Maybe 3 trucks. Limited activity. Instead we counted 6. Then 8. More headlights appeared farther south. Engines idled. Personnel moved between vehicles. None of it matched our intelligence packet. Mike lowered his binoculars. Write it down. I opened my notebook. Time. Direction. Estimated vehicle count. Every detail mattered. Luis transmitted a coded update. This time headquarters answered more quickly. Continue observation. No explanation. No questions. Just continue. The eastern horizon slowly turned gray. The first light of morning changes everything in the desert. Shadows shrink. Distances become easier to judge. Mistakes become easier to make. We adjusted the camouflage net one final time. Nobody stood higher than necessary. Even lifting your head too far above a ridge could give away your position. Hours passed. Heat returned. The cold disappeared as if it had never existed. The rocks beneath us slowly absorbed sunlight until resting your hand on them became uncomfortable. Flies appeared from nowhere. Fine dust settled onto everything. The smell of diesel drifted across the basin each time the wind shifted. It mixed with hot metal and dry earth. I remember thinking that even the air felt heavier than the night before. Around midday I checked our notes again. Something bothered me. The convoy traffic hadn't slowed. It had increased. Fuel trucks. Cargo vehicles. Communication trucks with tall antennas. Nothing fit the original briefing. I whispered to Mike. This is bigger. He didn't answer immediately. Instead he counted another line of vehicles entering from the west. Only then did he nod. I know. Luis called headquarters again. Long pause. Static. Then a reply. Maintain position. No further instructions. Eric watched another truck stop beside the others. That's not a temporary site. No, Mike said quietly. It isn't. Nobody said anything after that. There wasn't much to say. Our mission had changed without anyone officially changing it. We had come expecting to watch a small command post for a few hours. Instead, we were lying above something far larger than anyone had predicted. The realization settled over us one piece at a time. More vehicles. More antennas. More movement. More questions. I looked down at my notebook. The pages were already filling faster than expected. Then I noticed something else. Far beyond the convoy, almost lost in the afternoon haze, the western horizon no longer looked clear. A pale brown wall seemed to rise slowly above the desert floor. At first I thought it was smoke. Then Eric focused his binoculars. He watched for several long seconds. Finally he lowered them. His voice remained calm. Too calm. Mike. What? That's not smoke. Mike reached for the binoculars. A minute later he handed them back to me. I focused until the distant blur sharpened. The horizon itself seemed to be moving. Not vehicles. Not clouds. Sand. An enormous sandstorm was rolling toward us. When people think about intelligence failures, they usually imagine someone making a bad decision in a command center. That isn't how it feels when you're the one lying in the dirt. Out there, an intelligence mistake doesn't look dramatic. It starts with little things. One extra truck. A radio antenna where there shouldn't be one. Too many soldiers walking the same route. Small details. They stack on top of each other until you realize the picture in front of you no longer matches the briefing folded inside your pocket. That afternoon, we stopped talking almost entirely. Every pair of eyes stayed fixed on the basin below. The convoy activity never slowed. Instead of vehicles arriving, unloading, and leaving, they remained parked. Generators ran continuously. The steady vibration carried across the open desert. Even from our position, nearly 2 miles away, we could hear the low mechanical hum whenever the wind shifted in our direction. I began updating my notebook every few minutes. Time. Vehicle count. Direction of movement. Equipment. Personnel. I sketched rough positions on the paper map using a pencil worn almost flat. Our briefing had estimated fewer than 40 personnel. By mid-afternoon, we had counted well over 100. Maybe more. Some were impossible to track once they disappeared between vehicles. Mike studied the entire area through binoculars before speaking. They're building something. Eric didn't lower his optics. Or preparing to move. Neither possibility fit our orders. Luis unfolded the small directional antenna for the radio and adjusted its angle carefully. The transmission had to be brief. Long broadcasts increased the chance of interception. He pressed the transmit switch. Observation team to base. His voice remained calm. He read our updated report using coded references. When he finished, static filled the headset. Several seconds passed. Long enough that I wondered if we'd lost contact. Finally, a reply. Stand by. Nothing else. No instructions. No questions. Just stand by. Mike glanced at Luis. What do you think? Luis removed one earphone. I think somebody's reading reports they weren't expecting. That seemed likely. We weren't either. The afternoon heat became almost unbearable. The rocks beneath our elbows felt hot enough to burn exposed skin. Dust coated every piece of equipment. Every time I wiped the lenses on my binoculars, another thin layer settled almost immediately. Water discipline became stricter. Mike checked our canteens himself. Nobody complained. There wasn't enough water to waste. I took one careful sip. Just enough to wet my mouth. Then sealed the cap again. The desert teaches patience in strange ways. Later, Eric nudged my shoulder. 12 o'clock. I adjusted my binoculars. A large vehicle rolled slowly into the center of the compound. It wasn't another cargo truck. Its sides carried multiple communication masts folded against the roof. Within minutes, soldiers raised the antennas. Luis quietly exhaled. Communications. Mike nodded once. Write it down. I added another page to the notebook. Every observation pushed us farther away from the mission we'd been assigned. Whatever this location was, it wasn't temporary. It wasn't lightly defended. And it certainly wasn't the simple observation point described during the briefing. An hour later, another surprise appeared. Fuel tankers. 3 of them. They parked beside a row of transport trucks. Eric frowned. They're stocking up. Mike remained silent. I knew what he was thinking because I was thinking the same thing. Large fuel reserves usually meant one of two things. Either a major movement was about to begin, or one had already been delayed. Neither possibility belonged in our original intelligence packet. The radio crackled again. Luis answered immediately. This time headquarters had questions. Confirm vehicle count. Luis looked toward me. I handed him my notebook. He repeated our latest estimate. Silence. Another question. Any armored vehicles? Eric answered before anyone else could. Negative. Luis transmitted the reply. Again the radio went quiet. Mike leaned back against the rocks for the first time all day. Not to rest. Just to think. You notice something? He asked me. I looked across the basin again. I think so. No defensive perimeter. Exactly. For a location holding that many vehicles and personnel, security seemed strangely relaxed. There were guards, observation posts, routine patrols. But not enough. Not for something that appeared so important. Mike rubbed sand between his fingers. They don't think anyone's out here. He wasn't bragging. He was stating a fact. Our camouflage had done its job. We had become part of the landscape. Hours passed that way. Watching. Writing. Listening. Waiting. Sometimes people ask me what Special Forces missions felt like. I usually tell them to imagine sitting perfectly still in an uncomfortable chair for 10 hours while trying not to blink. Then imagine knowing one careless movement could end everything. That comes closer than most movies. Late in the afternoon, Luis quietly reached into his pack and pulled out another MRE. He looked at the label. Beef stew. Eric laughed softly. Wanna trade? What have you got? Vegetarian pasta. Luis held onto his meal. Never mind. Even Mike smiled. Tiny moments like that mattered. Not because they were funny. Because they reminded us we were still people underneath all the equipment. The laughter lasted maybe 5 seconds. Then binoculars returned to eyes. The mission returned. As daylight slowly began fading, shadows stretched across the basin. The lower sun revealed details hidden during the brightest hours. Fresh tire tracks. Temporary fuel bladders. Stacks of supply crates covered with camouflage netting. I carefully marked each one on the map. Then something unexpected happened. Several vehicles began leaving. Not many. 4 trucks. 2 communications vehicles. An escort. They headed north. Mike followed them until they disappeared beyond a low ridge. Movement. I noted the direction. Luis sent another report. This time headquarters answered much faster. Continue surveillance. No extraction update. No revised timeline. Only continue. That single word carried more weight than anyone outside the military might understand. Continue meant the mission had become more valuable. Continue meant somebody higher up wanted answers badly enough to accept greater risk. Mike folded his arms. They're changing priorities. No one disagreed. The sun continued sinking. Evening brought relief from the heat but introduced another problem. Our original extraction was planned before sunrise. Every additional hour increased the chance that weather, enemy movement, or simple bad luck could interfere. I checked the GPS. Everything still worked. Satellite lock remained steady. I checked the laser designator. Battery level normal. Optics clean. The equipment was ready. The question was whether we would ever be asked to use it. As darkness approached once more, the wind shifted. At first it felt welcome. Cooler air. Less heat trapped inside our uniforms. Then I noticed dust lifting from the distant ground. Not ordinary gusts. Sheets of sand rolled low across the desert floor. Eric adjusted his binoculars. I don't like that. Neither did I. The western horizon had disappeared behind a brown haze. What had looked distant only hours earlier now seemed noticeably closer. Mike studied it carefully. No panic. He spoke almost casually. But cover everything. Without another word, we secured every exposed piece of equipment. Extra batteries went into waterproof bags. The GPS disappeared beneath my jacket. Luis wrapped the radio connectors with tape to keep sand out. Eric cleaned his optics one last time before placing protective covers nearby. The wind strengthened. Tiny grains of sand began tapping against my sleeves. The sound was almost gentle. Almost. Mike looked west one final time. Then toward the darkening sky overhead. Finally he spoke the words none of us wanted to hear. If that storm reaches us before extraction. He didn't finish. He didn't have to. Every man on that hill already understood exactly what he meant. People think danger always announces itself. Sometimes it does. Gunfire. Explosions. Sirens. But sometimes danger arrives quietly, almost politely, giving you enough time to realize what's happening without giving you enough time to stop it. That storm was like that. At first, it looked manageable. Just another line of dust crawling across the western horizon. We had all seen smaller sandstorms before. They usually passed within an hour. Visibility dropped, equipment became filthy, and life continued. Mike watched the horizon through his binoculars for another minute before putting them away. It's moving faster than I thought. Nobody answered. We didn't need to. We could already hear it. Not a roar. More like countless tiny grains scraping across rock. A dry whisper growing steadily louder. The first gust struck our position just before sunset. Sand hit my sleeves with enough force that I instinctively turned my face away. Within minutes, the air carried a constant stream of dust. Not enough to blind us. Not yet. But enough that every exposed surface developed another thin layer of grit. I checked the laser designator. The protective covers stayed closed whenever we weren't using it. Even so, fine dust found its way into every seam. Out there, sand always won. Luis wrapped another strip of tape around the radio connectors. If this gets worse. He didn't finish. He didn't have to. Electronics hated sand almost as much as helicopters did. Mike ordered us to reduce unnecessary movement. No standing. No shifting unless you have to. We stay invisible. The storm wasn't our enemy. Drawing attention during the storm was. Below us, activity inside the basin continued. The convoy hadn't stopped. Mechanics worked beside vehicles. Soldiers walked between communication trucks. Generators kept running. Whatever operation they were preparing seemed too important to pause because of weather. Eric watched through his binoculars. They're staying. Mike nodded. So are we. Darkness arrived early. Not because the sun had fully set. Because the wall of blowing sand blocked what little light remained. I switched to my night vision goggles. The image looked terrible. Normally they turned darkness into shades of green. Now every gust filled the lenses with thousands of glowing particles. It was like trying to look through heavy snowfall. Except snow doesn't scratch glass. Sand does. I lowered the goggles. Sometimes naked eyes worked better. Visibility dropped below a mile. Then below half a mile. The basin slowly disappeared behind shifting curtains of dust. Our mission changed without anyone saying it. We were no longer observing vehicles. We were observing brief shapes appearing and disappearing between waves of blowing sand. Every report became less certain. Possible truck. Estimated movement. Unable to confirm. Nobody liked uncertainty. Military reports depend on confidence. The storm stole confidence first. Then visibility. Around midnight, Luis transmitted another scheduled update. He waited. Static answered. He tried again. Nothing. He adjusted the antenna. Changed frequencies. Checked battery connections. Finally a voice broke through. Weak. Broken. Copy. Continue. Then silence again. Luis frowned. Signals fading. Mike looked toward him. Keep trying every 30. Luis simply nodded. The wind became colder as the night deepened. The desert had fooled us again. Just hours earlier we'd been sweating beneath the afternoon sun. Now every gust carried enough chill to work through our uniforms. I pulled my gloves tighter. Even inside them, sand found my skin. I remember looking at my watch. Only a few hours until extraction. That thought comforted me more than I admitted. No matter how miserable conditions became, we only had to hold until before sunrise. That was the plan. Plans feel solid until weather gets involved. Sometime after 1 in the morning, Eric leaned closer. "You hear that?" We listened. At first I heard only wind. Then, nothing. Exactly nothing. The generators below had stopped. The vehicles weren't moving. The entire basin had gone strangely quiet. Mike slowly raised his binoculars. He couldn't see much. Neither could I. The storm had swallowed almost everything. Whatever the enemy was doing down there, the weather had hidden it completely. For nearly an hour we watched almost empty darkness. No movement. No headlights. Only blowing sand. The mission had become patience. Again. Luis checked the radio. Still nothing. He replaced one battery. Tried again. A burst of static. Then silence. The storm's killing it. Mike remained calm. As long as they can hear us once. That was enough. Maybe. I checked the GPS receiver. The screen remained active. Coordinates held steady. Satellite signal fluctuated but never disappeared completely. Paper maps suddenly felt much more reassuring. Technology worked until it didn't. Paper asked for nothing except dry hands. The sand reached inside everything. My notebook pages became rough. The pencil scratched instead of writing smoothly. Every time I opened my canteen, I tasted grit. Even the peanut butter packet from my last MRE carried sand around the edges. There was no escaping it. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, Luis suddenly raised one finger. Radio. We all stopped moving. A faint voice struggled through heavy static. Observation. Another burst. Copy. Static. Then clearer. Extraction delayed. Every one of us looked toward Luis. He adjusted the volume. The transmission continued breaking apart. Weather. Unable. Stand. Then silence. Complete silence. Luis tried immediately. "This is observation team. Say again." Nothing. He transmitted again. No response. Again. Still nothing. Mike waited almost a full minute before speaking. "What did you get?" Luis looked frustrated. "Extraction delayed." "Anything else?" He slowly shook his head. "No time. No estimated delay. No alternate pickup point. No backup plan. Just 2 words. Extraction delayed." I remember staring into the darkness after hearing them. Delayed could mean 20 minutes. Delayed could mean 6 hours. Delayed could mean tomorrow. Military language leaves room for interpretation. The desert doesn't. Mike unfolded the map beneath the faint red light. He never exposed it for more than a few seconds. Primary pickup stays the same. Luis looked up. "For how long?" Mike answered without hesitation. "Until we hear otherwise." That sounded reasonable. It also assumed we'd hear anything else. The wind continued strengthening. Another wave of sand rolled across our position. Visibility dropped again. Eric tried using binoculars. Worthless. Night vision. Worse. The laser designator remained packed away. There was nothing left to designate. Nothing visible enough to justify opening the case. I pulled my scarf tighter over my mouth. Every breath carried dust. The silence between us grew heavier than the storm itself. Nobody complained. Nobody questioned orders. Special Forces training teaches you something important. Panic solves nothing. Routine solves almost everything. So we followed routine. Battery check. Water check. Weapon check. Radio check. GPS check. Every 30 minutes. Again. And again. Hours passed that way. The eastern horizon should have begun showing the first signs of dawn. Instead, it remained hidden behind an endless wall of airborne sand. Time became difficult to judge. The storm erased distance. It erased landmarks. Soon it felt as though it might erase us too. Luis made one more attempt. He switched frequencies. Adjusted the antenna. Pressed the transmit button. His voice disappeared into the storm. He released it slowly. Nothing came back. Not static. Not interference. Nothing. He looked at Mike. Mike looked toward the empty sky where our Black Hawk was supposed to appear before sunrise. There was only darkness. Only wind. Only sand. Then, very quietly, Mike said the words none of us wanted to hear. "I don't think anyone's coming this morning." No one argued. Because deep down, we had already begun to believe it ourselves. There is a strange moment when hope changes shape. It doesn't disappear. It simply becomes quieter. After the radio fell silent, none of us said the words we were all thinking. We'd been left behind. Not abandoned. Not forgotten. Those are different things. Somewhere, people were probably trying to reach us. Pilots were likely waiting for weather reports. Officers were probably studying maps under bright lights inside command tents. But none of that changed where we were. 4 men. 1 observation position. No helicopter. No radio contact. No clear idea when either would return. Mike was the first to move. He didn't pace. He didn't curse. He simply opened his notebook and began writing. I watched him for a moment before asking quietly, "What are you doing?" Changing the timeline. That was how leaders survived. Not by wishing the plan had worked. By accepting that it hadn't. He looked at each of us in turn. Inventory. Nobody needed further explanation. Eric checked ammunition. Not because we expected a fight. Because accountability mattered. Magazine count. Loose rounds. Signal flares. Medical supplies. Everything was written down. Luis removed every battery from the radio. He tested them one by one with a small meter. 3 still held a usable charge. 1 was nearly dead. He marked each with a grease pencil before placing them back inside separate waterproof bags. "We rotate them," he said. "No unnecessary transmissions." Mike nodded. "Every hour." I opened my own pack. The GPS receiver still functioned, although sand had worked its way beneath the protective rubber buttons. The paper map looked far more dependable. Its edges were worn. Its fold lines had begun to soften from repeated use. But it still showed exactly where we were. Paper had one advantage over electronics. It never cared about batteries. Our water became the next concern. Each of us poured what remained from our canteens into a measuring cup from the medical kit. No one objected. The numbers mattered more than pride. Mike studied the amount for several seconds. "If we're careful." He paused. "We have 2 days." Nobody reacted. Not because we liked hearing it. Because we had expected worse. Food wasn't the problem. Water always was. Luis looked toward the hidden basin below. "You think they'll send another bird tomorrow?" Mike answered honestly. "I don't know." That was one thing I respected about him. He never invented confidence. If he didn't know something, he said so. The sun climbed higher. The storm had weakened enough for visibility to improve, but the air still carried dust. Everything looked faded. Muted. The convoy below slowly came back into view. To our surprise, activity had resumed. Vehicles moved again. Generators restarted. Men crossed between communication trucks. Whatever operation they were supporting had survived the storm almost untouched. We returned to observing. Because the mission hadn't officially ended. Around midday, I found myself staring at my watch more often than the objective. Every few minutes I caught myself listening for rotor blades. Nothing. Only wind. Years later, people have asked me what being isolated behind enemy lines felt like. Fear wasn't the strongest emotion. Waiting was. Waiting drains something out of you. You become alert and exhausted at the same time. Every distant sound could mean rescue. Or nothing. Eric finally spoke after nearly an hour of silence. I keep hearing helicopters. Luis smiled weakly. You actually hear them? Eric shook his head. No. He tapped the side of his helmet. I hear them in here. I understood exactly what he meant. Your brain begins filling empty spaces with familiar sounds. Rotor blades. Radio chatter. Truck engines. Anything except silence. Mike passed around another MRE. Nobody bothered heating them. Cold food required less attention. I peeled open a packet of crackers. Sand had somehow found its way inside the wrapper. I brushed off what I could and ate the rest anyway. Combat doesn't leave room for perfection. Luis laughed quietly. I used to complain about cafeteria food. Eric looked at him. I'd eat cafeteria food for a week straight. Mike finally joined the conversation. When I get back home. He stopped. Nobody interrupted. I'm buying a steak. Eric smiled. Medium rare? Rare. Luis laughed. That's optimistic. Mike shrugged. If we're making plans. His voice faded. The conversation ended there. Not because anyone wanted it to. Because each of us had drifted into private thoughts. I remember thinking about my parents. Not because I believed I was going to die. Because isolation makes ordinary memories seem more valuable. Sunday dinners. My father's old pickup truck. Coffee before sunrise. Things I never appreciated until they were thousands of miles away. Late that afternoon, Luis tried the radio again. Battery number 2. Different frequency. Longer antenna position. He transmitted slowly. This is observation team. Static. Nothing. He tried again. Silence. He looked at Mike. No contact. Mike checked his watch. Try again in an hour. Routine. Always routine. As the afternoon wore on, we quietly reorganized our equipment. The laser designator remained packed. Without communication, there was no reason to expose it. The GPS stayed off most of the time to preserve battery life. Instead, I relied increasingly on the paper map. Every observation I made went into the notebook. Vehicle locations. Estimated numbers. Changes since yesterday. If we ever returned, someone would need those notes. The mission still mattered. Even if no one could hear us. Near sunset, Eric stiffened. Movement. We immediately focused downhill. Not toward the convoy. Toward our own ridge. 4 Iraqi soldiers walked slowly across the rocks nearly half a mile away. Not searching. Patrolling. Their route angled across the desert without coming directly toward us. Nobody moved. Not even to adjust position. One careless motion would have reflected light. One silhouette against the rocks could have ended everything. The patrol stopped briefly. One soldier looked through binoculars. Not at us. Beyond us. Toward the horizon. After less than 5 minutes, they continued walking. Eventually disappearing behind another ridge. Only then did Mike exhale. Nobody moves. We waited another 10 minutes anyway. That was discipline. Never react too quickly. Sometimes people come back. Sometimes they don't. That patrol never returned. But it reminded us of something we had almost forgotten. The enemy wasn't the storm. The enemy was still out there. Night approached once again. Our second night behind enemy lines. Without extraction. Without communication. Without knowing whether headquarters even knew we were still alive. Luis quietly checked the batteries one more time. Only 3 remained useful. He looked at Mike. We're running out. Mike stared toward the eastern horizon where another dawn would eventually come. Then he spoke so softly I almost didn't hear him. If nobody reaches us by tomorrow morning. He stopped. No one asked him to finish. Because every man on that ridge already understood what tomorrow might force us to do. For the first time since the Black Hawk had lifted away. Staying where we were no longer seemed like the safest option. Hash. Looking back now, people sometimes ask me who made the decision. The honest answer is simple. Mike did. But that isn't the whole truth. In a special forces team, one man gives the order. Everyone else has to live with it. The second night passed more slowly than the first. None of us slept for more than a few minutes at a time. Mike rotated our watch schedule even though we were all awake. Routine mattered. It kept panic from finding an empty place inside your head. Around 3 in the morning, the wind finally eased. For the first time in nearly 24 hours, the desert looked almost familiar again. The stars returned. The ridgelines became visible. Even the basin below slowly emerged from the darkness. I lifted my binoculars. The convoy was still there. Some vehicles had moved. Others hadn't. Generators hummed once again. The communications antennas remained standing. Whatever operation we had discovered was clearly important enough to continue despite the storm. Luis tried the radio. Battery number 3. He adjusted the antenna carefully before pressing the transmit switch. Observation team requesting status. Nothing. He waited another 15 seconds. This is observation team, requesting extraction update. Only static answered. He looked toward Mike. Mike didn't say anything. He simply nodded once. Luis tried one final frequency. Silence. When he lowered the handset, nobody asked whether it had worked. We could tell by his face. The radio now had only one usable battery left. Not a full one. Just enough for a handful of short transmissions. Mike unfolded the paper map. No flashlight. Only enough moonlight to recognize the grid lines. He placed one finger over our position. Then another nearly 12 miles to the southwest. There. I leaned closer. The emergency link-up point? He nodded. It had been marked during the briefing but barely discussed. The assumption had always been that we would never need it. Now it was the only alternative we had. Luis broke the silence. If we leave. He looked toward the basin. We lose the target. Nobody corrected him. He was right. Everything we had documented during the past 2 days depended on someone remaining here. If headquarters somehow re-established contact and requested confirmation for an airstrike, we would no longer be in position. Without eyes on the objective, our information would quickly become outdated. Eric rested his binoculars on his knees. What if they come tomorrow? Mike answered without hesitation. They won't find us. That sentence stayed with me. Not because it sounded dramatic. Because it was practical. Extraction helicopters don't search endlessly behind enemy lines. They fly to a planned location. Wait a limited amount of time. Then leave. Nobody wanted another missing aircraft. The desert doesn't forgive delays. I found myself staring down at my notebook. 2 full days of observations. Vehicle counts. Supply movements. Communications equipment. Everything we had been sent to collect. It had taken hours of absolute stillness to record those pages. Leaving meant accepting that we might never add another line. Mike looked at each of us. I want opinions. He rarely asked that. Leaders often make decisions alone. Good leaders listen first. Eric spoke before anyone else. I'd stay. No explanation. Just those two words. Luis looked surprised. You serious? Eric shrugged. We still have water. Barely. We still have food. Barely. He looked back toward the basin. The mission isn't finished. Nobody argued. Because he wasn't wrong. Then Mike looked at me. What do you think? I wish I could tell you I had an immediate answer. I didn't. Even now, decades later, I remember how long that silence felt. Part of me wanted to remain. We had come this far. The target was more important than anyone had realized. Leaving could mean losing information that might matter later. Another part of me kept thinking about the radio. One battery. No communication. No extraction. No guarantee anyone knew we were still alive. Finally I answered. I don't think the mission is the same anymore. Mike said nothing. So I continued. We were sent to observe. I tapped the notebook. We observed. We were told extraction before sunrise. I looked toward the empty sky. That didn't happen. Luis quietly added another thought. If headquarters can't reach us. He paused. They can't update us either. That changed everything. Without communication, we couldn't receive new orders. We couldn't report changes. We couldn't coordinate air support. The mission had become disconnected from the people directing it. We were operating on yesterday's plan inside today's situation. Mike folded the map. Still no decision. The eastern horizon had begun changing. Not bright. Just slightly less dark. Dawn wasn't far away. Time had become our enemy. Every minute we waited made movement more dangerous. Eric checked the basin once more. No unusual activity. Luis looked toward the radio again. Almost hoping it would speak by itself. It didn't. I remember hearing birds. Just a few. Small desert birds. It struck me as strange. War below. Silence above. Nature paying no attention at all. Mike finally stood into a low crouch. That alone caught everyone's attention. He almost never exposed himself higher than necessary. He looked at the basin one final time. Then toward the route leading southwest. Nobody interrupted him. Leadership sometimes looks dramatic in movies. Real leadership often looks like one tired man staring at a map while trying to choose which risk he can live with. Several long seconds passed. Then Mike spoke. We leave before first light. Nobody moved. He continued. We take every notebook. Every battery. Every piece of equipment. We leave nothing behind. Eric lowered his head slightly. He understood what the order meant. The observation mission was over. Not because we wanted it to be. Because the situation had changed beyond what our original orders could support. Luis asked the question that had been sitting in everyone's mind. What if they call after we're gone? Mike looked directly at him. Then they call. No anger. No hesitation. Just acceptance. I think that was the hardest part. Not making the decision. Accepting that no decision would ever feel completely right. We packed in complete silence. The camouflage net came down first. Every stake was removed. Every scrap of tape collected. Every footprint brushed away as best we could. Our position had hidden us for 2 days. Now it had to disappear. I tucked the notebook deep inside my vest. The paper felt heavier than before. Not because it weighed more. Because it suddenly felt like the only proof we'd ever been there. The sky continued growing lighter. Still no helicopter. Still no radio. Still no voices except our own. Mike looked back toward the basin one last time. None of us knew it then. But that would be the last time any of us ever saw the objective we had spent 2 days watching. He adjusted his pack, looked at each of us, then gave the only order that mattered. Let's go. Without another word, 4 men quietly stepped away from the observation post, leaving behind the mission we had been sent to complete, and carrying with us a decision that would follow every one of us long after the war itself was over. Leaving was harder than getting there. Insertion had a clear purpose. We knew where we were going. We knew what we were expected to do. Walking away felt different. Every step carried uncertainty. We broke down the observation post with the same discipline we had used to build it. Mike insisted on taking an extra 10 minutes, even though daylight was creeping across the eastern horizon. No trace, he whispered. We all knew what that meant. Eric gathered every piece of camouflage netting and folded it tightly into his pack. Luis crawled through the shallow depression one final time, collecting tape, food wrappers, and even the small plastic corners we had cut from battery packaging. Nothing stayed behind if it could identify who had been there. I erased the temporary reference marks I had made with small piles of stone. Then I brushed away our footprints with a strip of canvas we carried for exactly that purpose. The desert would hide most of them soon enough. We weren't willing to wait. Mike looked over the position one last time. It was almost impossible to tell anyone had occupied it for 2 days. He gave a small nod. Move. We left in single file. Mike first. Me behind him. Eric. Luis covering the rear. The formation felt familiar. Comforting, even. Some routines survive regardless of circumstances. The morning air remained cold. The sandstorm had passed, but it left behind a thin haze that softened the horizon. Visibility had improved enough to travel. Not enough to relax. Nobody spoke for nearly an hour. The only sounds came from boots pressing into hard-packed ground and the occasional rattle of equipment despite our efforts to keep everything secure. I kept thinking about the notebook inside my vest. Every observation. Every sketch. Every coordinate. 2 days of patient work. We still had the information. But we had surrendered the ability to confirm anything new. That thought stayed with me longer than I expected. Around mid-morning we stopped beneath a rocky outcrop barely large enough to cast a shadow. Mike checked the map. I confirmed our position using the GPS receiver. The signal was weaker than before but still usable. We compared both. Always both. Neither system was trusted by itself. Luis finally broke the silence. You think they know we're moving? Mike didn't answer immediately. He studied the terrain ahead. They know where we were supposed to be. He folded the map. They don't know where we are. That distinction mattered. If headquarters attempted another extraction at the original site, they would find nothing. If they delayed long enough, they might never know why. Eric removed one glove and rubbed dust from his eyes. I keep wondering. What? If we waited another hour? Nobody responded. Because every one of us had asked ourselves the same question already. Would the helicopter have arrived? Would the radio have come back to life? Would everything have turned out differently? There were no answers waiting in the desert. Only more walking. The heat returned quickly after sunrise. The temperature climbed faster than any of us liked. Our pace slowed. Not because we were tired. Because movement during daylight required caution. We avoided open ground whenever possible. Shallow washes. Low ridges. Dry stream beds. Anything that kept our silhouettes below the skyline. Several times we froze completely while distant vehicles crossed roads far ahead. None came close. None seemed aware we existed. That was exactly how Mike wanted it. By early afternoon, we stopped long enough to divide water again. Nobody drank freely. Mike measured every portion with the same metal cup. Fair. Equal. No exceptions. Luis looked at his canteen. I never thought I'd miss ice. Eric smiled faintly. I miss refrigerators. That earned the closest thing to laughter we'd shared in days. Small conversations helped. Not because they solved anything. Because they reminded us that normal life still existed somewhere beyond the desert. As we prepared to move again, I glanced back almost without thinking. The observation ridge had disappeared into the distance. Only empty desert remained. For a moment, I wondered if someone else would eventually stand there. Maybe another reconnaissance team. Maybe years later. Maybe no one ever would. War leaves behind very few visible footprints. Most disappear with the wind. The afternoon stretched endlessly. The emergency link-up point remained several miles away. Far enough that every ridge looked like the last. The GPS confirmed we stayed on course. Still, I found myself unfolding the paper map repeatedly. Habit. Trust. Perhaps both. Late in the day, Eric suddenly dropped into a crouch. Mike copied him instantly. The rest of us followed without hesitation. No one asked why. You never ask first. You look first. Eric pointed toward the horizon behind us. At first I saw nothing unusual. Then, a flash. Not lightning. Too bright. Too brief. Several seconds later another flash appeared. This time larger. No sound reached us. Only light. Luis looked toward Mike. You seeing that? Mike nodded slowly. Nobody spoke for nearly half a minute. The flashes continued. Far away. Hidden beyond layers of heat haze. I felt my stomach tighten. The direction was unmistakable. The basin. Our basin. The place we had watched for 2 days. The place we had left only hours earlier. Eric lowered his binoculars. You think that's... He stopped himself. Mike answered quietly. I don't know. That was true. It could have been an airstrike. It could have been ammunition cooking off. It could have been something entirely unrelated. From our distance, there was no way to tell. The uncertainty somehow felt worse than knowing. I kept staring until the flashes stopped. Without thinking, I reached inside my vest and touched the notebook. Every page suddenly felt heavier. If those explosions were connected to the target, had our reports helped? Or had they happened without anything we recorded? Would staying another hour have changed anything? Or nothing at all? Questions arrived faster than answers. They still do. Luis finally looked away. I wish we knew. Mike adjusted his pack. We don't. His voice remained steady. And we're not going back. Nobody argued. Not one of us suggested turning around. The decision had already been made before sunrise. There was no halfway point anymore. You either committed to leaving, or you never truly left at all. As evening approached, long shadows returned across the desert. Our pace slowed once more. Fatigue had begun creeping into everyone's movements. Even Mike looked older than he had 2 days earlier. Not physically. Just weighed down. Leadership always carries invisible weight. He glanced toward the fading western sky one final time. The flashes were gone. The desert looked empty again. As though nothing had happened. As though we had imagined the entire mission. We resumed walking without another word. Behind us, whatever had occurred at the objective remained hidden beyond the horizon. Ahead of us lay only miles of open desert and the uncertain hope that someone, somewhere, was still expecting 4 Special Forces soldiers to come home. I didn't know it then, but that glimpse of light behind us would become one of the memories I returned to most often over the next 30 years. Not because of what I saw. Because of what I never would. By the 3rd morning, the desert no longer felt endless. It felt empty. There is a difference. Endless means there is always more ahead. Empty means you've stopped expecting anything from it. We had been moving for nearly 2 days since leaving the observation post. Our pace had slowed, not because we lacked discipline, but because exhaustion had settled into every part of our bodies. Nobody complained. Special forces teams don't spend energy describing discomfort. If something hurts, you keep moving until you can't. None of us had reached that point. Not yet. Mike checked the map every hour. I compared it against the GPS whenever we could spare the battery. The receiver still worked, though the signal drifted occasionally after the storm. Each time the coordinates stabilized, I marked our progress with a pencil. The emergency link-up point lay somewhere beyond a line of low ridges stretching across the horizon. It wasn't a base. It wasn't even a permanent landing zone. Just a pre-planned location that might be used if everything else failed. At the time, I never imagined we would actually need it. By mid-morning, the temperature climbed again. Our uniforms were stiff with dried sweat and layers of fine sand. Every movement released another cloud of dust from our sleeves and packs. Luis shook his canteen gently. Almost nothing remained. He looked at Mike. Half a cup. Mike nodded. Same here. Eric smiled weakly. I've been pretending mine's fuller. Nobody laughed. We all understood. Water had become more valuable than food. I realized I still had half a packet of instant coffee tucked inside an MRE. Normally I would have traded almost anything for hot coffee. Now it felt ridiculous. Coffee without water was just another piece of paper. Around noon, we stopped beneath another rocky rise. Mike motioned for security positions while I checked the GPS. The screen flickered. Satellite lock returned. I looked at the coordinates. Then checked the map. My heartbeat picked up just a little. We're close. Mike crawled beside me. How close? Less than 2 miles. Nobody celebrated. Experience teaches you that the final miles are often the hardest. We rested only long enough to take one careful drink each. Then we moved again. The terrain became flatter. More exposed. Less forgiving. Several times we dropped to the ground as distant military vehicles crossed roads far away. None appeared to notice us. Even so, Mike refused to rush. Slow is quiet. Quiet gets us home. Those were probably the longest 2 miles I've ever walked. Every ridge looked like the right one. Every shallow depression looked like the last. The GPS confirmed our direction again and again. Still, doubt never completely disappeared. Late in the afternoon, Luis suddenly stopped walking. He held up one finger. Radio. None of us expected anything. He inserted the final battery. Adjusted the antenna. Pressed the transmit switch. His voice sounded rough after days of breathing dust. This is observation team. Nothing. He waited. Tried again. This is observation team at emergency link-up route. Several seconds passed. Then. Static. Weak. Broken. Luis looked up immediately. I got something. He adjusted the antenna another few degrees. The static grew louder. Then a voice. Faint enough that we almost missed it. Say again. Luis nearly smiled. This is observation team. Another burst of static. Then clearer. Authenticate. Mike was already reaching into his pocket. He read the day's authentication code from a waterproof card. Luis repeated it over the radio. Silence. Long enough to make us wonder if the signal had disappeared again. Then the reply came. Clearer this time. Stand by. Nobody spoke. We simply stared at Luis. The radio crackled once more. Observation team. Another pause. Remain at current position. Extraction inbound. For a few seconds, nobody moved. Not because we didn't understand. Because we did. Those two words carried more relief than I can describe. Extraction inbound. Mike finally broke the silence. Set security. Training immediately replaced emotion. Eric covered the northern approach. I checked the map one final time. Luis conserved the remaining battery. Nobody assumed the helicopter had already arrived. There was still time for something to go wrong. The waiting felt different this time. Hope had returned. Carefully. Quietly. Nearly 40 minutes passed. Then Eric tilted his head. You hear that? This time we all did. Very faint. A rhythmic sound hidden beneath the wind. Rotor blades. Far away. Growing louder. Mike stood just high enough to retrieve an orange signal panel from his pack. He never unfolded it. Not yet. Only when the aircraft reached visual range. Several more minutes passed. Finally, a dark shape appeared beyond the southern ridge. Twin rotors. A Chinook. Lower than I expected. Flying carefully above the terrain. It circled once. Mike unfolded the signal panel. Luis activated an infrared strobe visible through night vision equipment. The helicopter turned immediately toward us. I remember the feeling more than the sight. The deep vibration reached us before the aircraft itself. Dust exploded outward as the Chinook settled toward the ground. The rotor washed through sand against our faces hard enough to sting. Crew chiefs waved us forward. We ran in a crouch. Nobody wasted time. Packs first. Then ourselves. The ramp lifted almost as soon as the last man climbed aboard. Inside, the noise was overwhelming. Hydraulic fluid. Hot metal. Diesel. Sweat. It smelled like every military aircraft I'd ever ridden. Only this time. It smelled like leaving. One of the crew chiefs handed each of us bottled water. Cold. I stared at it for a second before opening the cap. The first swallow almost hurt. My body had forgotten what cold water felt like. Eric laughed quietly after his first drink. I think that's the best thing I've ever tasted. Nobody disagreed. A flight medic walked over. You boys okay? Mike nodded. Tired. The medic looked at the dirt covering our uniforms. We thought we'd lost you. None of us answered. Those words stayed inside the aircraft longer than the noise did. We thought we'd lost you. So they had been looking. Maybe not immediately. Maybe not successfully. But they hadn't forgotten us. That mattered. Luis leaned back against the sidewall. You know what I'm thinking? Eric looked over. I'm sleeping for a week. Luis shook his head. I'm eating something that doesn't come in a plastic pouch. That finally drew a real laugh. The first genuine one in days. Even Mike smiled. Only briefly. Then he became quiet again. I noticed him staring through the open side window. Back toward the desert disappearing beneath us. I wondered if he was replaying the decision to leave. I know I was. The notebook remained inside my vest. Untouched. The pages somehow felt heavier now than they had on the ridge. The mission wasn't complete. The observations were. There is a difference. The helicopter continued south. Civilization slowly returned beneath us. Roads. Vehicles. Temporary coalition camps. Things we hadn't seen in days. The farther we flew, the quieter our team became. Relief settled over us. So did uncertainty. Nobody knew how headquarters would react. Nobody knew whether leaving the observation post would be questioned. Nobody knew if our decision had helped or complicated something much larger than ourselves. As the Chinook descended toward the forward operating base, Mike finally looked away from the window. He adjusted the strap on his pack. Then he said something so quietly that only the three of us sitting nearby heard it. We made it home. He paused for a long moment. I just hope we brought the right decision back with us. No one answered. Because none of us, not then, and not even decades later, could honestly say we knew the answer. Hash. People often imagine that the hardest part of a mission ends when you get home. Sometimes it begins there. The Chinook landed just before sunset. As soon as the ramp lowered, we stepped into a different world. Generators hummed across the forward operating base. Humvees moved between rows of tents. Mechanics worked beneath floodlights. Someone was laughing somewhere near the maintenance area. The war continued exactly as it had before we arrived. Only we had change. A medic checked each of us before we even reached the operations tent. Blood pressure. Hydration. Eyes. No serious injuries. Just dehydration, fatigue, and enough sand in our gear to fill another canteen. One medic smiled while brushing dust off my shoulder. "You boys look like you walked the whole desert." I almost answered. Instead, I nodded. In a way, we had. We were given fresh water, hot food, and 20 minutes to clean ourselves before reporting. 20 minutes wasn't enough to wash away 3 days behind enemy lines. It wasn't supposed to be. Mike changed into a clean uniform. The rest of us did the same. When we entered the briefing tent, the notebook was still tucked beneath my arm. It suddenly felt heavier than my rifle. Inside waited 3 officers. A major. A captain. An intelligence analyst I'd never seen before. The analyst looked more interested in my notebook than in any of us. Mike remained standing. "So," the major said quietly. "You made it back." Mike nodded. "Yes, sir." The major gestured toward the chairs. "Let's begin." There was no celebration. No congratulations. No dramatic speeches. Only questions. Time of insertion. Route. Observation point. Weather. Communications. Vehicle counts. Everything was recorded carefully. I handed my notebook across the table. The analyst opened it immediately. He didn't speak for several minutes. He simply turned pages. Studied sketches. Compared coordinates against maps spread across the table. Every now and then he underlined something with his pencil. Finally he looked up. "These counts are accurate?" "As accurate as we could make them." He nodded once. "I believe they are." Mike described the storm. The failed radio. The delayed extraction message. The loss of communication. No excuses. Only facts. Then came the question everyone knew was waiting. "Why did you leave the observation position?" The room became noticeably quieter. Mike didn't hesitate. "We lost communications." He spoke calmly. "We lost confirmed extraction. Our battery supply was nearly exhausted. Our water supply allowed limited endurance." He paused. I determined remaining in place no longer supported the mission. Nobody interrupted him. The major folded his hands. "You understood you were abandoning the observation point?" "Yes, sir." "And that higher headquarters had not issued that order?" "Correct." Silence returned. I remember looking at Mike then. He never once glanced toward the rest of us. Never searched for agreement. Never suggested someone else had influenced the decision. He carried it himself. The major looked around the table. "Did anyone disagree?" "My turn." I answered honestly. "No, sir." Luis spoke next. "No, sir." Eric followed. "No, sir." The major nodded slowly. Then he surprised me. He didn't ask another question. Instead, he looked at the intelligence analyst. The analyst closed my notebook. There would have been no further useful reporting once communications failed. The major looked back toward Mike. "I understand." That wasn't approval. It wasn't criticism either. Just understanding. Sometimes that's all soldiers receive. The meeting continued another hour. Most of it focused on the information we'd gathered. Vehicle locations. communications equipment, fuel storage, movement patterns. The analyst asked detailed questions about things I barely remembered noticing. The placement of antennas, the spacing between supply trucks, generator positions. Apparently, small observations become valuable when enough people connect them together. Near the end of the briefing, another officer entered quietly. He handed the major a folder. The major read one page, then another. His expression barely changed. He looked toward us. The planned strike package was cancelled. Nobody spoke. The weather prevented final confirmation. He closed the folder. Your reports remain valuable. But the operation did not proceed. I remember staring at the table. Cancelled. For years afterward, I kept returning to that single word. If we had remained, would confirmation have been possible? Would aircraft have arrived? Would the outcome have changed? Or would we simply have become 4 missing soldiers inside the same storm? No one could answer. After the briefing ended, we stepped outside into the evening air. The base suddenly felt noisy after days of silence. Generators, engines, voices, metal tools striking concrete. Normal military life. Luis finally broke the silence. So? Nobody answered. He smiled weakly. I guess we're still buying those steaks. Eric looked toward the mess tent. I'm starting with 2. Mike almost smiled. Almost. But something had changed in him. He thanked us for the mission. Then quietly walked away toward administrative tents. I didn't see him again for nearly 2 days. Later I learned why. He spent hours completing written reports, additional interviews, operational reviews. The decision had been his. So the paperwork became his as well. Several weeks later, Desert Storm ended. Like most soldiers, we packed equipment, cleaned weapons, signed forms, and prepared for home. Life moved surprisingly fast. Luis enrolled in college using the education benefits he'd talked about on that cold desert night. A year later, he married the woman whose photograph he carried in his notebook. Eric eventually became exactly what he'd hoped. A park ranger in Montana. Last time we spoke, he said he still preferred quiet places. That never surprised me. Mike retired several years after the war. He finally bought that ranch in Texas. We exchanged Christmas cards for a while. Then birthdays. Eventually even those stopped. Life has a way of separating people who once trusted each other with everything. Sometimes I wonder if he still thinks about that morning before sunrise. I suspect he does. Leaders remember decisions differently. Years later, someone asked whether I believed Mike had made the correct choice. I thought about it for a long time before answering. I still don't know. The truth is less satisfying than people expect. War rarely offers clearly right answers. Usually it offers 2 imperfect choices. You choose one. Then you spend years wondering about the other. Every now and then, I take out the small notebook from that mission. The pages have yellowed. The pencil marks have faded. Dust still hides between some of the folds despite everything I've done to clean it. Near the final page, I once wrote a simple note after we left the observation post. No emotion. No explanation. Just one sentence. Departed before first light. Asterisk. Whenever I read those 4 words, I remember Mike folding the map beneath the stars, looking toward an empty sky where our helicopter never came, and quietly giving the order that brought all 4 of us home. Whether it also left something behind, I have never been completely certain. Hash. People sometimes ask if I kept anything from the war. Most veterans don't bring home what people imagine. No secret documents. No dramatic trophies. No souvenirs taken from battlefields. What I kept would probably look ordinary to anyone else. A faded paper map. A worn notebook. A small Special Forces shoulder patch. 3 things that fit inside an old cardboard box on the top shelf of my closet. For years, I almost forgot they were there. Or at least I pretended to. Life has a way of filling the space after war. I came home. Found work. Got married. Raised children. Watched birthdays replace deployment dates on the calendar. Little league games became more important than operations orders. Mortgage payments replaced mission briefings. Eventually, Desert Storm became something people mentioned only during anniversaries on television. Most days, I hardly thought about it. Then every so often, usually before sunrise, I would wake for no reason at all. The room would still be dark. Completely quiet. And for just a few seconds, I wasn't in my bedroom. I was back on that rocky ridge, listening for a helicopter that never came. It happened often enough that my wife eventually noticed. "You awake again?" "Yeah." "Bad dream?" I never knew how to answer. It wasn't really a dream. Dreams change every time you have them. That memory never changed. The silence. The wind. Mike unfolding the map beneath a red flashlight. Luis waiting for the radio to answer. Eric watching through binoculars even after there was almost nothing left to see. The details remained exactly the same. Decades later, one autumn afternoon, years after I retired, I finally opened that old box again. Dust covered the lid. The cardboard had softened with age. Inside lay the same folded map. The same notebook. The same unit patch. Nothing else. I unfolded the map carefully. The creases had become pale white lines from being folded and unfolded so many times. The pencil marks were barely visible now. Our insertion point. The observation ridge. The emergency link-up route. Tiny notes written in the margins. Distance. Bearing. Water estimates. I traced one of the grid squares with my finger. Funny how a piece of paper can hold an entire chapter of your life. My grandson walked into the room while I was looking at it. He couldn't have been more than 10. "What is that?" "A map." "Of where?" I smiled. "A long way from here." He looked at it for another moment. "Did you get lost?" Kids ask honest questions. I thought about that before answering. For a little while, he nodded as though that made perfect sense. Then he ran back outside. I folded the map again. Maybe someday, when he's older, he'll understand that you can find your way home and still spend years wondering about the road you chose. Not long after that, I looked up the names of the men from our team. Luis and I still exchange Christmas cards. Every December. Never long letters. Usually just pictures of grandchildren. Sometimes a short note. He still signs every card the same way. "Stay safe. Old habits survive." Eric called me a few years ago. He had retired from the park service. He said he still preferred quiet places over crowded ones. I laughed. So do I. Neither of us mentioned the mission directly. We didn't have to. Some memories don't require conversation. Mike was harder to find. Eventually I learned that he had passed away several years earlier. A heart attack. Peacefully, according to someone who knew the family. His ranch was still there. Just like he'd planned all those years before. I sat quietly after hearing the news. Not because I hadn't expected it someday. Because it closed the last door to questions only he could answer. Did he ever regret giving the order? Did he replay that morning the way I did? Did he ever wonder what might have happened if we had waited one more hour? I'll never know. Sometimes people assume veterans spend their lives searching for closure. I don't think that's true. I think most of us eventually stop searching for answers that don't exist. Closure suggests everything fits neatly together. War rarely does. Some missions end. Some simply stop. That one stopped the moment 4 men walked away from an observation post before sunrise. Everything afterward was simply life continuing. Every Memorial Day, I take the unit patch out of that box. The green fabric has faded. The edges have frayed. The stitching has loosened in places. I hold it for a minute. Then I put it back. Not because I'm trying to forget. Because remembering doesn't require displaying it. The notebook is harder to read now. Pencil fades. Paper grows brittle. Near the last page, the final entry still remains. Departed before first light. Nothing dramatic. No emotional reflection. Just the fact. That's how soldiers write. Facts first. Feelings later. Sometimes much later. I have occasionally wondered whether someone eventually discovered the place where we had hidden. Maybe another coalition patrol. Maybe Iraqi soldiers. Maybe no one at all. The desert doesn't preserve footprints for very long. Wind takes care of that. It erases evidence without asking permission. But memory doesn't work like sand. Memory keeps what it wants. It smooths some edges. Sharpens others. Even now, after all these years, I can still picture the exact moment Mike looked toward the empty sky before making his decision. I can still hear the broken radio transmission. Extraction delayed. Asterisk. Nothing more. Just those 2 words. The rest was silence. People sometimes tell me we made the right decision because all 4 of us came home. Maybe they're right. Others might say we should have stayed. Maybe they're right too. I've lived long enough to accept that both thoughts can exist at the same time. The older I become, the less interested I am in deciding whether we were right. I'm simply grateful I knew 3 good men who trusted one another when certainty had disappeared. That feels more important now. This is the first time I've told this story from beginning to end. Not because the mission was extraordinary. Many teams carried out far more dangerous assignments than ours. I told it because ordinary decisions made under extraordinary circumstances deserve to be remembered too. Especially the quiet ones. Especially the ones that never appear in history books. When I finished folding the map that afternoon, I slid it back into the cardboard box. The notebook rested beside it. The old unit patch lay on top. I closed the lid gently and returned the box to the highest shelf in the closet. It's still there today. I don't open it very often. I don't need to. Because every time the world is quiet just before dawn, I am already holding that map in my hands again. And somewhere, in the stillness between darkness and sunrise, 4 Special Forces soldiers are standing beside a lonely ridge in the desert, listening for a helicopter that never arrives, before one calm voice quietly says the words that have followed me for more than 3 decades. ##. I've often wondered whether anyone remembers that observation post anymore. The wind has probably erased every footprint we left there decades ago. The rocks are still standing. The desert is still quiet. But the 4 men who once lay there watching the horizon have all taken different roads through life. Some are still here. Some are gone. Time never asked our permission. People sometimes ask me whether I'd make the same decision if I could go back. I usually smile before answering. Because they assume memory gives you certainty. It doesn't. Memory gives you perspective. I still don't know whether leaving before sunrise was the perfect decision. I only know it was the decision 4 exhausted soldiers had to make with the information we had, and sometimes that's all anyone can do in war. If you've stayed with me until the end, thank you for listening. Stories like this don't belong to history books alone. They belong to the men who carried them in silence for years. If this story meant something to you, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave a comment telling me where you're watching from, or if you or someone in your family ever served in the military. I read far more of those comments than you probably realize. Until next time. Take care of the people beside you. Because in the end, that's usually what we remember most. Not the mission. Not the medals. Just the people who walked through the darkness with us.